It's a rather bizarre situation for the royal family to find themselves in, but a catering assistant who worked at Buckingham Palace has admitted to stealing items from the Queen.
In March 2026, Princess Anne bypassed protocol to enter a restricted Windsor facility, uncovering a massive, systematic drain of missing royal inventory. Forensic evidence traced the missing assets directly to Queen Camilla's inner circle, revealing a high-stakes cover-up. This discovery threatens to shatter the monarchy's facade. This is the full story, the discovery that changed everything. Princess Anne was not supposed to be there that day. Nobody had scheduled a review, nobody had raised an alarm, and nobody inside the palace had flagged anything unusual about the Windsor storage vault in months. But Princess Anne had noticed something that everyone else had walked past without a second glance, and that one detail was enough to bring her through those reinforced doors in early March 2026 with two members of the Royal Collection Trust walking quietly behind her. What she found inside that vault over the next 4 days did not just disturb her. It fundamentally changed the atmosphere inside the palace in ways that are still felt today. Because the problem was not small, it was not administrative, and it was not the kind of thing that could be explained away with a misplaced spreadsheet or a filing error that somebody forgot to correct. There is a part of Windsor Castle that most people never hear about, sitting behind a set of reinforced wooden doors on the eastern corridor of the lower ward, completely off limits to tourists, invisible to cameras, and known only to a small circle of senior household staff and collection specialists who have clearance to enter it. It is a long climate-controlled storage vault that houses some of the most valuable objects in the entire royal collection. Furniture, silverware, ceremonial artifacts, private correspondence, and deeply personal items accumulated across generations of monarchs that are not displayed publicly and are not meant to be. They are simply supposed to stay exactly where they are cataloged, protected, and sealed against the world outside. Anne had not gone there looking for a scandal. She had gone there because a single line item had disappeared from a routine inventory summary that crossed her desk back in January 2026. One item, a Victorian-era silver writing set personally gifted to Queen Victoria by Prince Albert in 1851, catalogued in the Windsor inventory as recently as November 2024, and then simply gone with no transfer record, no loan agreement, no restoration note, and no explanation of any kind attached to its absence. She flagged it internally and was told it was likely an administrative error and that someone would look into it, so she waited and nobody looked into it, which is precisely the kind of institutional non-response that Princess Anne has spent 5 decades refusing to accept, because Anne is not a woman who lets things go, and anyone who has worked alongside her long enough understands that when she decides something needs an answer, she will find the answer herself, if the people around her will not find it for her. So she went herself, and what she found when she arrived at that vault with her 2 Royal Collection Trust specialists was not 1 missing item and not 2, because by the time the 4-day audit was complete and the physical inventory had been cross-referenced line by line against the official records, the list of discrepancies had reached a number that stopped everyone in that building cold. 38 distinct items either missing entirely or significantly displaced from their recorded locations with no paperwork anywhere in the system to explain how or why any of it had happened. Anne did not panic and she did not go to the press. She did what Princess Anne always does when she uncovers something serious. She closed the vault, gathered every document her team had produced during those 4 days, and went directly to King Charles, and that conversation, private and contained as it was intended to be, set off a chain reaction inside the palace that nobody in Camilla's inner circle had seen coming, and nobody in that circle was remotely prepared for. What was missing, and what it was worth. To understand why this discovery shook the palace to its foundations, you first need to understand what was actually missing. These were not spare chairs or old curtains sitting forgotten in a dusty storage room. These were irreplaceable objects. Items with both financial and historical value are inseparable from the story of the British monarchy itself. The Victorian silver writing set was only the beginning. Among the items recorded as missing or unaccounted for were a set of 12 gold-plated dessert spoons commissioned for the coronation banquet of King George VI in 1937, a hand-embroidered ceremonial cushion used during the investiture of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales in 1969, 3 leather-bound personal journals belonging to Queen Mary, grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, containing private entries written between 1920 and 1936. A pair of diamond and sapphire cufflinks gifted to King Edward VII by Tsar Nicholas II of Russia during the royal visit of 1894. And perhaps most significant of all, a sealed wooden box containing 14 personal letters written by Queen Elizabeth II to her mother, the Queen Mother, between 1952 and 1980. Letters that had never been made public and were never meant to be. Sit with that for a moment. Or private letters from one queen to another, spanning nearly 30 years, missing from a sealed royal vault with no record of where they went or who took them. Palace sources have estimated the combined financial value of the missing items at somewhere between 9 million and 14 million pounds. But those who understand the royal collection will tell you that the financial figure is almost beside the point. Some of these objects are genuinely one of a kind. You cannot replace a letter Queen Elizabeth wrote to her mother in 1964. You cannot put a price on a cushion that was present at a moment of royal history that will never be repeated. Once something like that is gone, it is gone forever. The question that Anne could not shake was not just what was missing, it was when it went missing. Because the inventory records told a very specific story when you looked at them carefully. The vast majority of the discrepancies could be traced to a window of time stretching from late 2022 to mid-2024. That window is important. That is the period immediately following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022. It is the period when the palace was in transition, when attention was focused on the coronation, on the new reign, on the extraordinary logistical challenge of shifting power from one monarch to the next. It is the period when nobody was looking too closely at a storage vault in the eastern corridor of Windsor Castle's lower ward. And here is the detail that made Anne's blood run cold. The vault required a key card and a personal access code to enter. The access logs, which the Royal Collection Trust maintains electronically, showed a pattern of visits during that window that did not correspond to any scheduled maintenance, loan arrangement, or official review. Someone had been going in and out of that vault during a period when no official business required it. Someone with access, someone who knew the system, someone who understood exactly which items were valuable enough to be worth the risk and exactly how long the chaos of a royal transition would buy them cover. The open question now was who. The implications of this breach reached far beyond a simple security lapse. Windsor Castle had long been considered an impenetrable fortress, its secure vaults guarded by a combination of centuries-old military tradition and state-of-the-art 20th century monitoring systems. For an insider to bypass these protocols without raising a single red flag for nearly 2 years suggested a level of sophisticated calculation that stunned the household staff. Anne spent hours staring at the computer terminal, reviewing the time-stamped data. Every entry code used was valid. Every electronic swipe of the keycard was registered to active personnel. Yet, when she cross-referenced the names attached to those credentials with the duty rosters from those specific dates, she found a series of impossible overlaps. Shifts that had supposedly been completed hours prior, staff members who were confirmed to be on leave, and security details assigned to entirely different wings of the castle. The perpetrator had not just stolen physical treasures, they had weaponized the palace's administrative blind spots in mourning. As the magnitude of the theft settled over her, Anne began to reconstruct the timeline of the transition period. In the autumn of 2022, the eyes of the global media were fixed on London and Windsor. Behind the scenes, thousands of historical artifacts were being cataloged, moved, or reassigned to accommodate the new king's household. The sheer volume of paperwork and physical moving parts created a perfect smokescreen. It was an environment where an extra crate or an unscheduled trip to the lower ward vaults could easily be brushed aside as part of the monumental effort to reorganize the estate. The thief knew this. They understood that the palace's institutional memory was fractured during those turbulent months, as veteran courtiers retired and a new administration took the reins. The thought of the 14 letters by Queen Elizabeth II staying in unknown hands was the most alarming prospect. While gold spoons and diamond cufflinks could theoretically be sold to unscrupulous private collectors on the black market, the private correspondence contained an entirely different kind of currency: raw, unvarnished history. These letters covered the Suez Crisis, the turbulent decades of social change in Britain, and the intimate struggles of a family living under the permanent glare of the public eye. In the wrong hands, the contents of that sealed wooden box could rewrite chapters of modern history or be used as an unprecedented tool for leverage against the institution itself. Anne closed the ledger, the silence of the archival room suddenly feeling oppressive. The realization was undeniable. The thief was still out there, likely walking the very same carpeted corridors she walked every day, hidden in plain sight behind a mask of flawless royal service. The trail leads to Camilla's circle. Palace investigations of this nature are not like police investigations. There are no flashing lights, no formal arrests, no public statements issued while things are still unfolding. What happens instead is quieter, more deliberate, and in many ways, more devastating. Documents are reviewed, access logs are cross-referenced, phone records are examined, and slowly, carefully, a picture begins to form. The security personnel involved do not wear uniforms. They carry folders and move through the palace corridors like ghosts. The picture that formed in the weeks following Princess Anne's discovery pointed in a direction that made the situation extraordinarily delicate. Because the access logs did not point to a rogue staff member acting alone, they pointed to a cluster of individuals, people connected not to the old household of Queen Elizabeth II, but to the newer networks that had formed around Queen Camilla since her husband's coronation in May 2023. This political shift of the guard had brought a brand new wave of associates into the ancient corridors of power. Let's be precise about what the sources are saying here. Nobody is accusing Queen Camilla herself of walking into that vault and removing items. That is not what the evidence suggests, and it is not what palace insiders are claiming. What the evidence does suggest is considerably more troubling in a different way. It suggests that people inside Camilla's personal network, individuals who had been granted access to royal properties and royal systems, specifically because of their closeness to the Queen Consort, used that access in ways that were never authorized. They operated under the protective umbrella of her newly elevated social circle. The name that kept surfacing was not a household name to most people outside royal circles. His name was Roland Fitch, 61 years old, a former antiques consultant who had worked on and off with the royal household since the early 2000s. He had no formal permanent role. He was what the palace calls a retained specialist, someone called in periodically to assess, value, or advise on items in the royal collection. Because of this specialized background, he had access to the codes, he had the keycard clearance, and his name appeared in the vault access logs on 7 separate occasions between October 2022 and April 2024. Here is what made that significant. There was no official reason for Roland Fitch to have been in that vault on any of those 7 dates. The Royal Collection Trust had no record of commissioning any work from him during that period. No valuation request, no assessment brief, no restoration consultation, nothing. His visits were entirely off the books, conducted during hours when the lower ward corridor was largely deserted. And Roland Fitch had a connection that the palace found impossible to ignore. He had worked directly and repeatedly with Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, on at least 3 commercial projects between 2018 and 2023. Projects involving high-end food branding, luxury event curation, and the sourcing of antique decorative items for private clients. The 2 men were not strangers. They were associates with documented work histories and a shared commercial appetite for rare historical objects. But Roland Fitch was not the only name in the access logs to raise an alarm. 2 other individuals appeared across the same window of visits, forming a tight, recurring pattern of entry. A woman named Priscilla Denby, identified in palace records as a personal stylist and household aide retained on Camilla's staff since 2023, and a man named Geoffrey Challoner, a retired diplomat who had served as an informal advisor to Camilla's private office during the transition period following the Queen's death. Neither of them had any business being in that inventory vault. Neither of them had any official reason to be anywhere near those items. Their respective roles in styling and diplomacy provided absolutely no baseline justification for reviewing secure historical assets. And yet there they were, logged in the system, their entry times and exit times recorded with the quiet indifference of an electronic system that registers facts without asking questions. When Anne presented this information to King Charles, the room went very still. The air inside the quiet private study grew heavy as the sovereign read through the printed spreadsheets. Because Charles understood immediately what this meant, it did not just mean missing artifacts, it meant that people connected to his wife's personal circle had potentially been inside the most sensitive storage space in the royal household during the most vulnerable period in the monarchy's recent history, without authorization and without explanation. And nobody had noticed until his sister went looking. The security breach exposed a profound structural vulnerability at the heart of the new court. It revealed that the administrative boundaries between private friendships and institutional security had become dangerously blurred during the frantic rush of the royal transition. For Charles, the revelation presented a painful dilemma, forcing him to confront the reality that the threat to the crown's treasures came from within the newly established household network. The palace cover that almost held. Here is where the dramatic story takes a sudden turn that should surprise absolutely nobody who has been paying close attention to how the modern palace operates behind its grand gilded facade. When Princess Anne first brought her highly detailed findings directly to King Charles in mid-March 2026, the response she received was definitely not the one she expected. She expected urgency. She expected immediate, decisive action to rectify the dangerous situation. What she got instead from the sovereign was hesitation and deep reluctance. Charles was thoroughly exhausted. He was unwell, fighting significant personal health battles, and utterly drained by the heavy ongoing burden of his royal duties. Furthermore, he was already managing the catastrophic fallout of Prince Andrew's shocking arrest in February 2026 on serious criminal charges connected to the notorious Jeffrey Epstein network. He had the entire Andrew situation consuming his complete attention, his daily energy, and what little remained of his political capital inside the royal institution. The very last thing he needed, or so the anxious people around him apparently decided, was another massive, explosive scandal erupting from inside the palace walls, especially a scandal that directly touched his wife, Queen Camilla. Sources familiar with the tense internal discussions say that two senior courtiers, both with long-standing ties to Camilla's personal household staff, strongly advised Charles to treat the missing inventory as a simple, internal administrative matter. Their core argument to the king was straightforward, protective, and transactional. Launch a quiet internal review. Recover what could be recovered through private, unofficial channels. Keep the whole thing entirely away from external investigators, completely away from the investigative press, and above all, away from Prince William. Handle it exactly as the palace had always handled uncomfortable truths throughout its long history. Quietly, slowly, and entirely behind closed doors, where nobody on the outside could see the internal dysfunction. Charles, worn down and caught between loyalty to his wife and the sharp warnings his own instincts were sounding, did not immediately reject that self-serving advice. For approximately 3 weeks, the investigation sat in a kind of suspended state, frozen in the bureaucratic amber of royal diplomacy. Anne was told repeatedly that the matter was being handled by the appropriate people. She was told to allow the proper internal channels to do their work. She was essentially told, with all the frostbitten politeness the palace can muster, to step back and let it go. She did not step back. Instead, she did something that the senior courtiers advising Charles had completely failed to anticipate. She went directly to Princess Catherine. The two royal women have never been publicly described as particularly close or intimately connected. Their relationship has always been cordial rather than warm, deeply respectful rather than intensely intimate. But in this critical moment, they were aligned by something far more powerful than personal affection or casual friendship. They were aligned by a profound, shared understanding of what was truly at stake for the future stability of the British monarchy. Catherine, who had spent months fighting her way back from grueling cancer treatment, and who was now functioning as one of the most active strategic minds in the palace, understood immediately what the institutional cover attempt meant. It meant the problem was real. If it weren't real, nobody would be trying so desperately to bury it. Catherine went to William without delay, and William, who had already been managing the Andrew crisis with a clarity and decisiveness that made the rest of the paralyzed palace look entirely frozen, did not hesitate for a single day. He went directly to the Lord Chamberlain's office and demanded a formal, thorough external review of the Windsor inventory discrepancies. Not an internal review managed by compromised courtiers with connections to the households under scrutiny, but an independent external process with absolutely no institutional loyalty to anyone whose name appeared in those access logs. The two courtiers who had advised Charles to suppress the matter were quietly and unceremoniously removed from their roles within 72 hours. No formal public announcement was made. Their names simply stopped appearing in palace communications. Everyone inside the building understood what that meant. The cover had almost held. 3 weeks of institutional inertia had nearly buried the whole thing. But it had not counted on Anne's stubbornness, or Catherine's strategic clarity, or William's absolute refusal to let the palace's oldest instinct, the instinct to protect itself at any cost, override the fundamental need to find out what had actually happened. This modern, unified trio broke centuries of traditional royal code to ensure the truth survived, altering the palace forever. Ultimately, the institutional machinery failed to suppress what Anne uncovered. The quiet intervention by William and Catherine signaled a structural shift in how accountability is handled within the family. It proved that the old playbook of silence, delay, and obfuscation can no longer survive in the face of younger generations demanding transparency. By forcing an independent external audit, they drew a definitive line in the sand, demonstrating that protecting the crown now requires facing the truth rather than hiding it behind closed palace doors ever again. William's steps. In Camilla Goes Silent, by the first week of April 2026. The delicate balance of power and secrecy inside the centuries-old palace had shifted entirely. The independent external review demanded by the Prince of Wales was already fully underway, piercing through the traditional layers of institutional protection. The highly sensitive, electronically compiled vault access logs had been formally and securely submitted directly to the external investigators. Crucially, the names of Roland Fitch, Priscilla Denby, and Geoffrey Challoner were no longer a tightly guarded secret, held by a mere handful of panicked people whispering behind the closed doors of a private room. Instead, they had become a permanent part of an official, legally structured process that could no longer be managed, reshaped, stalled, or quietly made to disappear by protective royal courtiers. Prince William's direct involvement completely changed the daily atmosphere within those historic stone walls. Staff members and aides who work closely with the heir to the throne describe a man who operates under extreme pressure with a kind of focused, icy calm. This unyielding demeanor is far more unsettling to those around him than an explosive display of anger ever could be. He does not shout at subordinates. He does not make grand theatrical speeches about duty. He simply asks questions, clear, direct, and uncomfortably precise questions that instantly cut through bureaucratic misdirection, and then he waits patiently for answers. The people around him understand with absolute certainty that there is no version of this reality where the answers do not eventually come. During this tense period, William met privately with the Lord Chamberlain, with the executive director of the Royal Collection Trust, and with the head of palace security. In each of these high-stakes meetings, according to sources close to the process, his core message remained uncomfortably identical. He wanted to know exactly which historical items were missing from the collection. He wanted to know exactly who had authorized access to those areas. He wanted to know exactly what the palace leadership had known, and precisely when they had first known it. Most pointedly, he wanted a rigorous accounting of why it had taken an unscheduled, independent audit by Princess Anne to surface a critical institutional problem that should have been caught months or even years earlier. That final question landed the hardest among the palace hierarchy, because the honest answer was deeply uncomfortable for the institution. The monitoring systems that should have flagged the unauthorized vault visits had not suffered a technical failure. They had worked perfectly all along. The access logs had been there from the beginning, sitting undisturbed in a secure digital database, recording every single entry and every single exit in precise electronic detail. The real problem was not that the technology had missed the breach. The problem was that nobody had been looking at the data. In the chaotic aftermath of the royal transition, in the frantic scramble of a new reign establishing its footing, and under the overwhelming weight of everything that had demanded urgent royal attention from September 2020s, Onward, a storage vault in the lower ward of Windsor Castle had simply fallen through the cracks of administrative oversight. William made it ruthlessly clear to everyone involved that this systemic oversight was completely unacceptable, neither as an explanation nor as an institutional excuse. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the palace, Queen Camilla had gone quiet in a specific, calculated way that everyone in the royal household immediately noticed. She carefully continued her scheduled public appearances, maintaining her royal obligations without fault. She attended every event, smiled warmly at the right moments, and said absolutely nothing publicly that acknowledged any of the immense turmoil building behind the scenes. However, sources inside the palace describe a woman who was watching the unfolding investigation with great care while saying very little in private either. Her regular communications with her son, Tom Parker Bowles, were significantly reduced. Her meetings with Roland Fitch, which had apparently been a regular, comfortable feature of her informal weekly schedule, stopped entirely. Her total silence was its own kind of powerful statement. Camilla, whatever else might be said about her long history, is not a passive figure. She is not someone who instinctively retreats from conflict or hides from controversy. The fact that she went completely quiet suggested she fully understood the gravity of what was unfolding around her. She understood that anything she said, even casually to staff, could become part of the official record. She was smart enough to know that in a formal palace investigation, the written record is everything. King Charles found himself trapped in an almost impossible, heartbreaking position. He is the sovereign, but he is also a husband who loves his wife deeply. He has spent decades of his life fighting against public opinion and institutional resistance for his right to have her beside him on the throne. Now, the very same institution he had sacrificed so much to lead was conducting a formal investigation that led directly into the immediate orbit of the woman he had chosen. Sources close to Charles say he is not angry at his sister, Anne, for uncovering the discrepancies, nor is he angry at William for pushing so hard for absolute transparency. He understands at some fundamental level that the survival of the modern monarchy depends on accountability being real, not just a public relations stunt. But understanding a harsh truth and living daily with its consequences are two very different things, and Charles is living with those consequences now. Tom Parker Bowles, for his part, issued no statements to the press. He abruptly canceled 2 major public appearances in April 2026, citing vague personal commitments. His social media presence, never particularly restrained in the past, went almost entirely dark. The man who had been loudly and publicly championing British culinary heritage projects and royal branding initiatives for months was suddenly very difficult to locate. The external investigators, working completely independently and with full unrestricted access to the electronic logs, the physical vault, and the palace's digital records, submitted their preliminary report in the 3rd week of April. While its contents have not been officially made public, 3 people familiar with its findings have described it to sources close to the royal family in terms that are impossible to misread. The report apparently confirmed that the unauthorized access had occurred exactly as Anne's initial audit had suggested. It explicitly confirmed a direct connection between those who accessed the high-security vault and individuals in Camilla's personal network. Most explosively, it recommended that the entire matter be referred to external law enforcement for further criminal review. That recommendation was the exact moment everything changed again. What this means for the monarchy's future. Step back from the immediate granular details for a brief moment. Step back from the specific names of compromised aides, the electronic access logs, and the missing silver writing set. Look instead at the much bigger picture. Because what is currently happening inside the palace walls right now is not simply a scandalous story about missing historical artifacts. It is a profound story about institutional power, genuine accountability, and whether the modern British monarchy is truly capable of holding itself to the same rigorous standards it demands of everyone else in society. This is certainly not the first time the palace has faced a defining moment like this. Think about what happened in the chaotic aftermath of Princess Diana's tragic death in 1997. The institution was forced to painfully confront the massive gap between its own internal self-image and how the watching public actually saw it. Think about the catastrophic Prince Andrew scandal and the years of careful management, suppression, and bureaucratic delay that ultimately made the eventual public reckoning so much more damaging than it ever needed to be. Think about every single time the palace chose a quiet, convenient cover-up over an honest, transparent accounting, and invariably paid a much steeper price later because of it. The repetitive pattern is not hard to see, and the immense cost of repeating it is one that Prince William, perhaps more than anyone else alive in that building, understands completely. What makes this specific historical moment entirely different is who is driving the institutional response. In the past, the palace's primary instinct was always to protect itself from the outside world, to aggressively manage the public narrative, strictly control the flow of information, and present a sanitized version of events that minimizes long-term damage to the institution. That ancient instinct is still very much present. Those two senior courtiers who recently advised King Charles to suppress Princess Anne's initial findings were acting entirely within the established tradition for handling such sensitive matters. But something fundamental has changed. The older generation that built its entire identity around that tradition of secrecy is no longer the one making the decisions that matter most. William is making those decisions now. And William operates from a fundamentally different ethical premise. He does not believe the monarchy is protected by institutional secrecy. He believes it is destroyed by it. He has watched that destructive process happen in real time across his entire adult life. He has watched the grand institution he will one day lead pay the price again and again for choosing short-term silence over long-term accountability, and he is simply not willing to repeat that toxic cycle. The formal referral to external law enforcement, if it proceeds exactly as the preliminary report recommended, would be absolutely extraordinary. It would mean that individuals intimately connected to the Queen Consort's personal circle face intense criminal scrutiny from authorities entirely outside the palace's control. It would mean that the Crown, for perhaps the first time in living memory, chose genuine accountability over institutional self-protection when the two came into direct conflict. That is not a small thing. That is a fundamental seismic shift in how the monarchy understands its own constitutional responsibilities. For Queen Camilla, the long-term implications are incredibly serious, regardless of what the investigation ultimately concludes about her personal knowledge or direct involvement. The people in her immediate circle, the people she brought into close proximity to the royal household, and the people who carried her personal trust as a credential. Inside those walls are now at the absolute center of a formal investigation. That is an institutional stain that does not wash out easily. It does not matter whether she knew what was happening. In the unforgiving court of public opinion, which for a modern monarchy is the only court that ultimately counts, proximity is its own verdict. For her son, Tom Parker Bowles, the situation is even more precarious. His commercial ambitions, his ambitious branding projects, and his high-profile food ventures, dressed in the prestigious clothing of royal heritage, all of them now sit under a dark cloud. Every business proposal he has made, and every relationship he has cultivated inside the royal household, will be reviewed through a completely different lens. The question people will ask is no longer what Tom wants to build. The question will be what Tom was willing to do to build it. For Princess Anne, there is something both vindicating and quietly sobering about how this is unfolded. She found the loose thread. She pulled it. She absolutely refused to let the institution's oldest reflex, the reflex to look away and hope the problem resolves itself, override her own strict sense of duty. That is entirely in keeping with who she is and who she has always been. But anyone who knows Anne understands that this is not a moment she takes personal pleasure in. She did not go into that secure vault looking to damage her brother's wife. She went looking for a missing silver writing set. What she found instead was a problem that now has to be resolved in public, with all the disruption and pain that entails, because the alternative was allowing it to fester in private until it became something even worse. William has said nothing publicly about any of this. He will not. That is also entirely in keeping with who he is. He does not need to speak. His actions speak for themselves. The external review, the swift removal of the courtiers who tried to suppress it, the formal law enforcement referral, and the absolute refusal to allow the palace's instinct for self-preservation to override the need for truth. These are the decisive actions of a man who has already decided what kind of king he intends to be. And they are a preview of a future reign that will look very different from anything that has come before. The monarchy is changing, not peacefully, not without real human cost, and not without moments that are genuinely heartbreaking for the people caught inside them. But it is changing, and the woman who started all of this by noticing a single missing line in a routine inventory summary, the woman who has spent over 5 decades doing the work without asking for credit, the woman who went into that vault herself because nobody else was going to, deserves to have that acknowledged. Princess Anne did not save the monarchy from a scandal. She gave the monarchy the chance to save itself. Whether it takes that chance, whether it follows through with the full accountability that William is demanding, whether it proves that the change it keeps promising is real and not just another carefully managed royal performance, that is the question the next several months will answer. And the world is watching. Princess Anne walked into that vault looking for one missing item and walked out carrying the weight of 38. The palace tried to bury it, the courtiers tried to manage it, and William refused to let either of those things happen. What comes next will define not just Camilla's place inside the monarchy, but the entire direction of a reign that is already rewriting the rules. If this story told you something the palace did not want you to know, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you do not miss what we uncover next. Drop your thoughts in the comments below because we read every single one, and the best questions shape exactly what we investigate next. The truth inside those palace walls is still unfolding.